According to Acts 13, Paul and Barnabas were commissioned by the church in Syrian Antioch, or Antioch on the Orontes, to go out as missionaries. They first preached the gospel throughout the land of Cyprus and then sailed to the mainland, landing at Perga in the region of Pamphylia. They journeyed along the Via Sebaste, or the Augustan Road, north into the region of Pisidia to another Antioch, a city that would become an important landmark on the map of Paul's missionary work. It is not altogether clear why Paul and Barnabas headed for Pisidian Antioch in particular. It may simply be that, having conducted evangelistic work in Syria, Cilicia, and Cyprus, heading to the principal city of the next province to the west was the logical next step. Some have speculated, however, that Sergius Paulus, the Roman governor of Cyprus and Christian convert through Paul's preaching and wonder working, might have had something to do with the ministry team's decision. Inscriptions in Antioch bear witness to the fact that Sergius Paulus and his family had deep roots there, such that Paulus might have both requested of Paul and Barnabas to visit his home territory and used his family connections to facilitate their entrance into and establishing themselves in Pisidian Antioch, however brief their first visit turned out to be in the end. Despite immediate hostility from members among the Jewish community, Paul and Barnabas appear to have planted the seeds of a congregation there before they were driven out of the city by the Jewish community's leaders in concert with the governing authorities. From Pisidian Antioch, they journeyed east along the Via Sebaste to Iconium and Lystra, after which they made a short detour to Derbe. Paul and Barnabas visit Antioch again on their way back from Derbe to Perga, strengthening the disciples' souls, encouraging them to persevere in the faith, appointing elders for them in every congregation, as we read in Acts 14, verses 21 to 23. It seems most probable that the author of Acts depicts Paul visiting Pisidian Antioch yet again when he speaks of Paul, Timothy, and Silas traveling through Phrygia and Galatia in Acts 16:6, for this journey was explicitly undertaken to revisit and strengthen existing congregations. Come, Paul says to Barnabas in Acts 15:36, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Though this becomes the point at which Paul and Barnabas part ways, Paul does take Silas on this planned journey, going through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches, as we read in 1541, and on to Derbe and Lystra, where he enlists Timothy and continues on carrying word of the apostolic decree. The most natural understanding of this trajectory would see Paul continuing to Iconium and Pisidian Antioch with this report, not taking a far detour to the north on a presumed evangelistic journey to the cities of North Galatia, Ancyra, Pessinus, and Tavium, without Luke giving any notice whatever of church planting in these cities. Indeed, when we speak of the journey undertaken in Acts 15:41 as Paul's second missionary journey, we are misrepresenting the first and longest leg of the journey. According to Acts, Paul's missionary work does not begin on this journey until he passes into Macedonia, where the church planting work resumes. Paul would visit Pisidian Antioch and its sister cities a fourth time then, at the outset of his third missionary journey to Ephesus, as he passes again through Phrygia and Galatia, strengthening all the disciples, as we read in Acts 18:23, using the same language as we found in Acts 14:22. Although a matter of long-standing debate, many scholars, myself included, believe that Paul's letter to the Galatians was addressed to the congregation in Pisidian Antioch, along with its sister churches in Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, all of which fall within the Roman province of Galatia during the time of Paul's active ministry. We have clear documentation of evangelistic activity among these cities, and Galatians would be the term most appropriately and inclusively used by Paul to address people resident in all four cities, even in the context of such a phrase as, "You foolish Galatians," as we read in Galatians 3:1. Pisidian Antioch, visited at least 4 times by the apostle and his team, emerges therefore as an important hub for the Pauline mission, even as it was an important hub for the imperial highway system and for the provincial imperial cult that, together, put the city squarely on the Roman map. This is not to belittle the cities of Iconium, Lystra, or Derbe, or minimize the importance of the Christian congregations planted there. From an archaeological point of view, however, these 3 cities have very little to offer in the way of helping us to imagine the setting, both physical and ideological, of Paul's ministry. Derbe was incorporated into the Roman province of Galatia upon the death of Amyntas, one of Rome's client kings, in 25 BC. The tell of the Acropolis of this ancient city, however, remains undisturbed by archaeological activity to this day. Lystra, located on the Via Sebaste, the principal Roman road through the province, has met with equal neglect. One artifact bears witness to the location of the ancient city, an inscription now kept in the Archaeological Museum of Konya, providing the complete name of the Roman colony, Colonia Julia Gemina Felix Lystra. Beyond this, the remains of a Roman bridge, still visible within the renovated structure, are all that bear witness to a once vibrant Roman colony. The state of archaeology at Iconium is similar, but for an entirely different reason. Roman Iconium sits beneath the major modern city of Konya. While the archaeological museum there boasts a number of significant smaller finds, from 91 inscriptions from Roman Iconium to a marvelous 3rd century AD sarcophagus decorated with carvings of the 12 labors of Hercules, no excavations of any significance have been possible. For this reason, Pisidian Antioch provides us with our best and fullest representation of the context of Paul's Galatian churches. Antioch was founded in the early 3rd century BCE by Antiochus I Soter, one of many cities that would be named Antioch or Seleucia in honor of the rulers of the Seleucid Empire. Though technically within the region of Phrygia, the city sat close to the Pisidian border and came to be called Pisidian Antioch to distinguish it from the many other cities named Antioch in Asia Minor and Syria. Very little remains today of the Hellenistic period city. The ruins of a temple dedicated to the Anatolian moon god Main, standing just a few miles outside the city, date back to the early Hellenistic period, though there is evidence that an earlier sanctuary existed there already in the classical period. The worship of Main is thought to have been imported by the city's first settlers, some of whom came from the westernmost part of Turkey, where Main was a prominent deity. The theater, in the heart of the city, also dates back originally to the Hellenistic period, though it was remodeled and expanded significantly during the late Roman period. At its grandest, in the 3rd century AD, it extended over the road that ran alongside the original, smaller theater. Pedestrian and wheeled traffic continued to pass through a tunnel that had been provided under the top tier of seats. Although Paul is remembered to have preached his first 2 sermons in Antioch in a Jewish synagogue, there is no direct archaeological evidence of a Jewish presence in the city, despite the overzealous claims of archaeologists to have found such evidence below either the 4th century Christian basilica in the heart of the old city, or the 4th century Church of St. Paul, built nearer its northern edge. The literary evidence, however, is strong. Josephus records that when the region of Phrygia was becoming unruly under Antiochus III, the king resettled 2,000 Jewish families from Babylonia to the most important places within the regions of Phrygia and Lydia to stabilize the situation. These settlers were granted land for houses and crops, distributions of food until their own crops became productive, an exemption from taxes for 10 years, ensuring their goodwill toward the crown. Antioch would surely have been one of these important places. Phrygia and Galatia came under direct Roman rule in 25 BC, united in the new Roman province of Galatia. Antioch was at first a terminus of, and later a major junction of, the Via Sebaste, or Augustan Road, built by Augustus in 6 BC to facilitate troop movement to the eastern frontier. Augustus himself elevated the city's status to that of a Roman colony, the Colonia Caesarea Antiochia, and he injected new life into the city by settling upwards of 3,000 veterans and their families there. These families would have felt a strong bond of personal loyalty to the Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland, as Augustus and his successors were named throughout the empire. Augustus would have been regarded as their own family's patron. The city's water supply was dramatically increased to accommodate the growing population. A new aqueduct, a 2-story arched structure, was constructed to bring in water from the hills north of the city. The aqueduct brought water to the Castellum Aquae, the principal reservoir, and a nymphaeum, an ornate pool from which residents could draw water, both on the north side of the city. While the remains of the nymphaeum are scant indeed, such water pools were often magnificent structures in their prime. The nymphaeum at Antioch might once have resembled those at nearby Aspendos or faraway Gerasa. This nymphaeum was provided with a large paved courtyard. A modest but adequate bath complex was added west of the nymphaeum later in the 1st century AD. Prominent among the ruins of the city are many pieces of the original water pipes that carried water throughout the city, both from the aqueduct and from the older springs that had supplied the city prior to its refounding as a Roman colony. Remains of this water system are also evident in the great open square in the heart of the city, perhaps originally supplying another public fountain. Remains of this running water was also supplied to public latrines, both flushing the waste and providing water for personal hygiene. One of the easily overlooked achievements of the Roman Empire was its emphasis on supplying running water throughout its cities. After the Byzantine period, people would not again enjoy this level of sanitation, personal hygiene, and ready availability of clean water until after the Renaissance. The city's internal roads were also improved. In the typical Roman fashion, there was a major north-south road called the Cardo Maximus, and a major east-west road called the Decumanus Maximus. The Cardo began at the Nymphaeum and continued south past shops and the major public buildings and plaza of the city center, continuing south until it intersected with the Decumanus. The full extent of the Cardo south of the Decumanus awaits further excavation. The Decumanus ran west from the Cardo, past the theater, latrine, and another host of shops. Its eastern wing, beyond the Cardo, also awaits further excavation. A stretch of 3 or 4 shops or offices along the Decumanus are particularly well preserved, probably because they were once covered by the renovated and extended theater. Very few public buildings survive or have been uncovered on the site. The city no doubt had the usual assortment of temples. An inscription bears a dedication to Jupiter, best and greatest, and a cult statue of Jupiter has been discovered on the site, suggesting the presence of a temple to the chief deity of the Roman pantheon. By far the most impressive structure on the site today, as no doubt in Paul's lifetime as well, is the Augustaeum, a monumental temple built to honor Augustus as a god, likely completed by the turn of the era. The temple had a footprint of about 85 by 50 feet, with an estimated original height of between 45 and 55 feet. In form, it likely resembled the Temple of Portunus in Rome from the Republican period, a temple that has weathered the centuries marvelously. A colossal cult image of Augustus would have sat within the temple. It would have been visible through a pair of large doors in the front of the sanctuary proper. The sacred space was rendered far more impressive by the construction of a two-story semicircular portico behind the temple. Straight porticos extended from the tips of the semicircle past the temple, creating a vast open courtyard, the sacred precinct of the temple, of about 300 feet squared. Remnants of the ornate carvings that once adorned the architraves of the temple and porticos alike, featuring the common sacrificial motif of garlands and the heads of bulls, litter the surrounding area. These decorations are reminiscent of the sacrifices that would have been performed here to honor Augustus on the 23rd of every month, in celebration of his birthday on September 23rd, expressing loyalty and gratitude to the emperor for his divine gifts and as particular benefactor of this colony, as well as to petition the other gods, like Jupiter, best and greatest, for the emperor's continued well-being during his lifetime. The worship of Augustus continued long after his death as his official recognition by the Senate as a god, after which it was customary to refer to him as the divine Augustus in all public inscriptions. The city fathers and rich donors further aggrandized this monument by constructing a massive gateway called a propylaeum or propylon to the sacred area. Almost nothing remains of this building today, except for its footprint. Comparison with an archival photo of the propylon as it was excavated in 1924 shows that significant spoliation has occurred in the intervening century. Be that as it may, this was originally a magnificent three-arched gateway similar to others found throughout the empire, like this one, from the Decapolis city of Gerasa. The propylon was decorated with statues of members of the imperial family. One of these showed a male figure, perhaps Augustus himself, with a barbarian kneeling before him as a captive. Such art communicated a clear message to the indigenous inhabitants around Antioch. One way or another, they would submit to Roman rule. During the reign of Tiberius, a rich citizen named Titus Baebius Asiaticus paved a large open area in front of the propylon, naming it Tiberius Square in honor of Augustus's successor. Once surrounded by shops, bars, and restaurants, this area functioned as a place for recreation and commerce. Some of the few remaining paving stones still bear the markings of the game boards that had been scratched into them in antiquity. Citizens gathered to enjoy some of the benefits of the imperial peace here in the shadow of the great Augusteum complex. One of the most important inscriptions from the Augustan period is the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the things accomplished by the divine Augustus. The emperor composed this text himself in the months prior to his death, intending it to be the epitaph on his life's achievement. The inscription speaks of his deliverance of the Roman world from civil war, that is to say, the war he himself waged against Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII, effectively brought to an end with Octavian's victory in the naval battle at Actium in 31 BC. It speaks of his successful neutralizing of threats to the borders, his lavish benefactions upon the Roman people, the staggering number of public buildings erected at his expense, that is, from his share in the spoils of war, his diligence in rewarding veterans, and the many public honors awarded to him on account of his virtue. Augustus ordered that this lengthy document be engraved on bronze plates and placed in front of his mausoleum in Rome. A copy of the lengthy inscription in both Latin and Greek was found inscribed in the ancient temple of Rome and Augustus in Ancyra, modern Ankara, in Apollonia in Pisidia, and here in Pisidian Antioch on the propylon in front of the Augusteum. About 100 pieces of this inscription, which appears to have been intentionally demolished at some point in antiquity, were found in the area of Tiberias Square. Many of these pieces are now assembled like a jigsaw puzzle, missing many of its pieces, in the museum in the modern town of Jalvac that adjoins the archaeological site. Two sentences from the Res Gestae are particularly appropriate as we consider Antioch. Augustus recalls how citizens everywhere, privately as individuals and collectively as municipalities, sacrificed unremittingly at all the shrines on behalf of my health, end quote. The Augusteum in Pisidian Antioch was one such temple, where such sacrifices were offered to the emperor as to a god. In another place, Augustus recalls how, quote, in Africa, Sicily, Macedonia, the two Spanish provinces, Achaia, Asia, Syria, Narbonian Gaul, and Pisidia, I settled colonies of soldiers, end quote. Pisidian Antioch was one of these veteran colonies whose inhabitants felt a personal debt of gratitude to the emperor who had provided them and their descendants with precisely the economic footing for which they had endured 20 years' service in the legions of Rome. Paul's letter to the Christians here and throughout the cities in the southern part of the province of Galatia does not seem to intersect as much with the material culture of Pisidian Antioch as does, for example, 1 Corinthians with Corinth. In part, this is probably due to the fact that the challenges Paul must address in Galatians have come upon the congregations in this province from outside the province. Jewish Christian teachers who are following Paul's steps in order to correct his errors vis-a-vis the ongoing role of the Torah in defining the people of God and alignment with God's righteousness. In part, however, this is also due to the admittedly scant state of the excavations in Pisidian Antioch when set alongside the work that has been done to bring ancient Corinth or Ephesus to the light of day. Nevertheless, the lived spaces of Pisidian Antioch that have been unearthed, being prominently centered around the expansive cult site of the Augusteum, suggests that Paul's audience, both his converts and their unsupportive neighbors, would have heard significantly political overtones in his initial and ongoing proclamation of a son of a God who came as a savior to bring deliverance to the whole world, whose coming was good news for all people. The term gospel, good news, euangelion, no doubt as common in Paul's preaching as it was in his letters 7 times in the letter he would later send to the Christians in Antioch, appears in imperial as well as Christian contexts, though in plural forms rather than the singular typical in Christian discourse. An inscription from Priene in the Roman province of Asia, dated to about 9 BC, looks back to Augustus's birth as the beginning of good news, euangelion, for the whole world. Josephus applies the same term to Vespasian's accession to imperial powers at the end of the civil wars of AD 68 to 69. A gymnasiarch in Pergamum also uses the term when honoring Augustus. Augustus was lauded as son of the deified Julius, Divi Filius, on the legends of coins and in public inscriptions, as were his own successors in relationship to him, son of the deified Augustus, Divi Augusti Filius, after Augustus's death and formal divination by the Senate. While Latin distinguishes between a god deus, and a deified being, divus, Greek does not. Augustus and many of his successors were called Son of God, huios theou, using the phrase that would also be applied verbatim to Jesus in the New Testament and no doubt in the early preaching of Christian missionaries. Augustus was also hailed as a savior, soter, another common way to speak of Jesus in early Christian discourse. And what Paul calls this present evil age from which deliverance is desperately needed in Galatians 1:4, the majority in Pisidian Antioch would have celebrated as the golden age of the Augustan peace. When Paul identifies that savior, that agent of deliverance, as Jesus, the Son of God, he applies titles commonly ascribed to the emperor in Rome to a Judean provincial who had been shamefully executed for sedition. His message would have been heard in Antioch as a challenge to imperial ideology on all fronts, as would the witness of Christians increasingly during the first 3 centuries of the church throughout the empire.